discussed last week, many famous Americans were or are Freemasons. Franklin Roosevelt, Earl Warren, Hugo Black, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, even Ronald Reagan. And yet there exists a tremendous enmity between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has condemned solemnly Freemasonry from 1738 until 1960. Pope Pius VIII in 1829 wrote that their God is the devil and their cult is turpitude. But on the same hand, Freemasons have clearly stated their antagonism to the Roman Catholic Church. In the American Freemason, we can read as follows. This magazine has never swerved from the position that between the Masonic fraternity and the Catholic Church, there is an antagonism inherent in the nature of the organizations. The one seeking broadest liberty of thought and the other trying to stifle all revolt against this authority. We have declared that there can be no true peace nor even truce between Freemasonry and the official Roman Church. They are opposing poles of thought. I'm Julius Smetona. This is When Catholics Believe. I'd like to welcome my guests back again, Mr. Paul Fisher, publisher, editorialist, and writer. He was the author of Behind the Lodge Door, an expose of American Freemasonry, and Their God is the Devil. Also with me is Father Clarence Kelly, Superior of the Society of St. Pius V and Spiritual Director of St. Joseph's Novitiate in Round Top, New York, a congregation of traditional Catholic sisters. Father Kelly is also an author. He wrote Conspiracy Against God and Man, which deals extensively with European Masonry. You know, last time we were getting into the question of Franklin Roosevelt's court-packing scheme, which supposedly was frustrated, but in reality was not, in that he eventually had 8 Freemasons who were on the Supreme Court and who probably effected the most profound social change in this country's history. We had a country which in the 19th century at least 3 separate occasions was declared to be a Christian nation by the Supreme Court. We had a country in which abortion was illegal, adultery was illegal, it was illegal to transport birth control devices through the mail. Margaret Sanger in the 1920s was arrested, the head of the foundress of Planned Parenthood, for advocating birth control devices. Blasphemy was illegal. Prayer in schools was not uncommon. Government aid to official religions was not uncommon. And yet, we are now living in a world which is largely the creature of 8 men who legalized abortion, have tolerated blasphemy, and so on. Mr. Fisher, how have the Masons been responsible for this?
Well, about the 8 men, this has fluctuated from 5 to 4 to 8 to 1. 8 to 1 may have lasted for a term or two, but until 1971 they still dominated the courts in that ratio. Sometimes it may have been 7 to 2 and so forth. They struck down, the key one was the Everett decision of 47, which brought in this idea of a wall of separation. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was no wall of separation. And all precedent court opinion prior to that time was encouraging Christianity in this country. Those 4 decisions, you said 3, there are actually 4 decisions which the court has said this is a Christian nation. Presidents have said it. I mentioned John Adams and Abraham Lincoln and William Henry Harrison in their inaugural addresses identify the United States as a Christian nation. The Masons are vitally viscerally opposed to Christian religion, particularly the Catholic Church, but fundamentally to all religions which believe in a supreme being. To them, the supreme being is man. They're completely naturalists, they're Gnostics, they boast about being Kabbalistic Gnostics. At any rate, we had this whole Christian aura to the country. Kids had Bible reading in public schools. You had the prayer in public school. The court knocked that out. I did a little research on the FBI's statistics of crime. I took it from the time that the FBI organized their statistics, which was a 30-year period, and for the 10-year period subsequent to knocking Bible reading and prayer in school out. And the violent crimes from just 10-year period were something like 3 or 4 times larger than they were in the entire 30-year prior to those statistics by the FBI. And that was when people believed in God. Once you knock God out of the equation, you have no fear of anybody. You don't fear the president, you don't fear your parents, you don't fear your superiors or anything else. And that's what's happened to this country. And not only was it the prayer and the Bible reading and bus rides, but it was also these same courts knocked out blasphemy laws. You can look at all the laws, the civil laws in the country, both at federal and at state level, and you can get the 10 Commandments. All the civil laws were upholding the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, honor thy father and thy mother, keep holy the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath laws? The stores were closed on Sundays.
Right.
They knocked that out. That
I'm not that old. I can still remember when.
Well, you've heard of it. Yeah, you've seen movies of it.
I've seen it myself. You didn't do it on Sundays. It was peaceful on Sundays.
So all of these things have been knocked out by the Supreme Court. So consequently, the court establishes the moral tone of the nation. If the court says Christianity is out, you can blaspheme Christ, you don't have to admit he's the Redeemer, you can blaspheme the God of the Jews, man is supreme, and that's what we're getting. So people are groping. Parents are concerned frequently about their kids going off with Moonies and other religious organizations.
Moonies, what about the devil worshippers?
Well, the whole thing, there's an outreach for God, for some supreme being, for something to hang on to. They know it's not in this world. When a guy's falling out of an airplane, he doesn't say, "Oh, Julius, save me." He says, "Oh, God, help me." Even though he's an atheist, he's going to shout for God. But they're looking. But the court is trying to get that out of their mind. And that's how the New Age movement came in, with this whole thing of the court. For a 30-year period, they established, and it's important to keep in mind, that in jurisprudence, once a decision is established, they call it stare decisis. A similar case comes before the court, any court, they rely on a precedent opinion. So here you had the court establishment 30 years of precedent opinions. To this very day, as of last June, the court is still citing this Everson decision in 1947 and this idea that we must fear giving any aid to parochial schools. Just the other day, a federal court decided it does not violate the Constitution to allow the Ku Klux Klan to march, even though the possibility of riot may be there. Unless the riot takes place, the state cannot intervene, and that's kind of freedom of speech. But teaching God in school, there's a terrible danger that the country is going to be turned over. And they're selling this. These are guys, modern man is saying that God is dangerous to civilization.
Or saying a prayer at a graduation. The Supreme Court has forbidden that just recently.
That was the case. That was the case when they brought it in 47.
It's interesting.
Right.
We mentioned... Yes, Father, go ahead.
I think, though, to put it in the proper context, people are probably wondering, well, why are they doing this? Why would these rulers of Masonry be seeking the annihilation of Christianity and specifically the destruction of the Catholic Church? And is that really true? And, you know, are these a couple of quacks who are identifying this relatively benign and benevolent institution as some force for evil? And the answer is, you can tell by the response of the popes. If you read the encyclical of Leo XIII on Masonry, Leo XIII was not a kook or a quack or a right-winged extremist. Leo XIII was a very brilliant, very fine, educated, and a wonderful pope. Leo XIII wrote a wonderful encyclical. It's, even from a literary point of view, it's a masterpiece. But Leo XIII makes it very plain what Masonry is. Masonry simply is. It is the modern version of the devil's assault upon God and upon the church. And what distinguishes Masonry from the efforts that have gone on in the past is that the devil has organized men in a very fine way. The power of Masonry is not only that it is a conspiracy directed by evil men, but that it is a conspiracy directed by evil men who are in our day and age carrying on the fight against the kingdom of God. It has to be put in that context to understand that it's not just a question of a few men or a small sect of people who are liberals. It has to be put in that bigger context, I believe, to really grasp why it is they are so absolutely dedicated to the establishment of this new arrangement which excludes God, which excludes our Lord.
To amplify what Father Kelly said, Mr. Fisher, perhaps you could describe part of the initiation oath for into the 30th degree of Freemasonry. What takes place? What is said?
Well, they're also all along about cutting your throat and ripping your heart out and so forth, which is a terrible intimidation of the guy to not release any secrets. But anyway, when you get to the 30th, the Knight Kadash degree, the candidate comes into the room and there are 3 skulls on the table. One skull has a crown on it, another skull has the papal tiara, and the 3rd skull has a laurel wreath. So the candidate is led to the first crown, or the papal tiara, and he recites the word, "Down with imposture, down with tyranny." With that, he takes a poignard and he stabs the crown, the tiara on the crown.
The Pope's
tiara.
They hate the idea that someone can claim your conscience or can dictate what you must believe. And this
someone who represents God on earth.
That's right. They can't stand the idea of authority.
Well, that's it. Then the second, it does the same thing to the crown, which is the state. This is church and state. That's a symbolism. That's not only that Philip the Fair, which it's to represent, and Pope Clement XII. And then he does the same thing to the crown, which is the state. In this case, it was Philip the Fair. And then the third is the laurel wreath. Well, that's Jacques de Molay, and that's mankind. And he bows down and praises mankind. And that goes back just quickly to the trial, which was held over a period of 7 years. All sorts of witnesses were brought. There was some torture involved in some of the confessions, but those people, some
You're talking about the Knights Templar in the 1300s.
In the 13th century, and it was destroyed just because the Knights Templar were accused, and substantial evidence that they were committed homosexual acts, they urinated on the crucifix, and a lot of terrible things like that, which the people of the day were just appalled at. And so they read this in Latin when the charges are made, and then whoever headed up the court said, "Now, would you like this translated in the vernacular," which had been in French. Said, "No, we don't want to hear all that," because they were just terribly embarrassed and shocked about what these accusations were against them. At any rate, de Molay was burned at the stake for this, and de Molay promised that the Pope and the King would die within a year or something. Well, one of them did. I forget whether it was the Pope. The Pope was 6. I think it was the Pope that did the King didn't. It was several years later that he died. But at any rate, that's how much they hate the church. The key is, it goes back really to the Garden of Eden. They say, right, they admit they're Kabbalistic Gnostics. Gnosticism, man will be saved by knowledge. And back in the Garden of Eden, remember, they ate the so-called forbidden fruit. And God indicating the Trinity way back in the Old Testament, which is in the Pentateuch too, that they will be as us. They want to be gods, the plural, the Trinity concept. And so that's what it is. Man wants to be God, and that's what Masonry can't stand. If you're concerned about life hereafter, they consider you're not going to be concerned about the welfare of the nation, and you're not going to be concerned about the poor out on the streets. Nobody's done more through the centuries to help the poor in the streets. Mother Teresa is a modern example than the Roman Catholic Church. And indeed, all churches have helped the poor and the destitute with their kitchens, their hospitals. Hospitals, the whole idea. Education is a Catholic idea. The idea of the hospitals is tremendous in the Catholic Church. And they are concerned about the welfare of the here and now, but they realize that this world is not the end. Masons don't like that attitude.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing.
I'd like to just add, with regard to the Masonic ideology and this attack upon the crown and the tiara, the reality of the situation is that all authority comes from God, and that all legitimate civil rulers receive their authority from God. You may have a different mechanism to select the person who will occupy the office, but essentially that authority comes from God. And so it is also in the church, that authority is conferred by Almighty God upon a legitimate Roman pontiff and upon the bishops and so forth and so on. But this attack upon the tiara and the attack upon legitimate civil authority, which are Masonic ideals, are also communist principles. See, communists are anarchists, essentially. They believe that all government authority is intrinsically evil, and that the ultimate goal is the destruction of all legitimate civil authority. And they say the mechanism of doing this is to assume the dictatorship of the proletariat, that they would assume this this great dictatorial authority, but the purpose of the assumption of that dictatorial authority is to destroy all legitimate governments. And then when you destroy all legitimate governments and you destroy all religions, then man will be returned to the natural state. He will not be corrupted or spoiled or destroyed either by religion or by government or by family or by private property. And these ideals of communism are actually products of, to a great extent and for the most part, of Freemasonry. And Leo XIII points that out in his encyclical on Freemasonry.
Clearly so. That's James Billington, the present Librarian of Congress, wrote a book, Fire in the Minds of Men, which he said that not enough credit is given to the revolutionary movement originated in the lodges. So if you want to understand the revolutionary movement, because Masonic philosophy and dogma is communist. That's exactly what it is. In the French society, there was a phrase, there are no enemies to the left. They've always supported the left. They established the government in Spain. That's why all this anti-Franco...
During the 1930s, during the Spanish Revolution, and Mexico.
In Mexico.
Sure.
That was all communist. And communism made the same way in Fatima when Our Lady appeared.
That's right.
Was a communist and Masons behind the whole thing.
And that Masonic government in Mexico instituted a bloody persecution against the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. You know, we were talking about the Masonry, primarily their ideas in the United States. The interesting thing which has happened, I'd say, in the last, say, 30 years has been the changing attitude of the post-Vatican II Church to Masonry. Previously, the penalty for a Catholic joining the Masons was automatic excommunication, and he can only be reinstated by the Pope himself unless he was on the verge of death. Now we're faced with a situation where in the new Code of Canon Law, nothing about that is said at all, and implicitly by Cardinal Sapir, it is one is led to believe that Catholics may join the Masons, and in fact Catholic bishops and priests and laity have been joining the Masons in large numbers, and some bishops in fact have received citations from Masons that they exemplify Masonic thought. What are your feelings about this?
Well, that's true, and I think in the book I point out that that the Masons were active at pre-Vatican II. The thing was getting organized, and the Grand Commander noted that we have people present there. And so they got largely what they wanted out of the... somebody accused Archbishop Lefebvre of saying that it's influenced by Masonry. And he's a Dominican, he's in the Vatican today, I can't think of his name, he's a Frenchman. And he said, doesn't the Archbishop know that's what the Vatican II is all about? Liberty, equality, fraternity. And that concept is in the document. Is it Freedom of Religion? Is that the, I forgot the title.
It's the Dignity of Man, Dignitas Humanae.
The documents of... Yeah.
But I would say this, that as communism and socialism might be looked upon as the secular and political arm of Masonry, you can look upon modernism as the theological arm of Masonry in this sense. One of the fundamental principles of modernism is naturalism and pantheism.
Maybe you could explain what naturalism is.
Naturalism is a system of belief which excludes God, where you consider only the natural aspects of creation, and the theistic aspect of naturalism would be pantheism, which simply means that there is no God transcendent to creation who exists and who brought everything into existence out of nothing, but rather God is identified with the material world. So pantheism simply means that everything is God. But modernism itself, the modernists who virtually control virtually every Catholic seminary in the world that I know of, the modernists have this naturalistic concept of religion, and many of them are actually pantheists. That is to say, they identify God with the universe. So from the point of view of the influence of Freemasonry, we could say that the anarchy that you find, the socialism and the anarchy, would be the political manifestation of Masonic ideology, and the modernism, the naturalism, the pantheism that we find so dominant today would be a kind of theological manifestation of Masonic religious principle.
Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile, Father Kelly, this profound change in attitude toward Freemasonry? We have, for instance, a picture of John Paul II receiving members of the B'nai B'rith Lodge. We have the new Code of Canon Law, which drops any reference to Masonry. How could this be? After 22 years of condemnation, now suddenly it's tolerated, it's okay. In this country, at least, many churchmen are active Masons, and many bishops okay their parishioners and their subjects to become Masons.
I think it's a question of seeing the reform in the context of history. What is the nature of this reform that has taken place? Is it a question simply of a temporary lapse into to unorthodoxy? Is it maybe a kind of Protestant Reformation from within, a temporary setback, or whatever it may be? In my own personal opinion, and I've expressed this opinion before, I personally am of the opinion that we are living in the age of the great apostasy. The apostasy that took place at the time of the Protestant Reformation, the apostasy that we saw in the time of the French Revolution, these were sort of local, specific, and limited. But the apostasy that we see in the church today is a kind of a general thing. It's virtually any place you go, and every place you go, you find this deterioration of the Catholic faith. You find the destruction of orthodoxy. So personally, in my own opinion, I think that we are living in the age of the great apostasy, and I think that, as Leo XIII points out, there is this great struggle between the forces of God and the forces of Satan, between the city of God and the city of man, and that in modern times this struggle is manifested most especially by the organization that you find in Masonry. That Masonry is the chief, most effective, most powerful instrument of Satan in its attack upon the church, and that it is to a great extent responsible for the deterioration that has taken place, for the apostasy that has taken place. And then quite logically, if that is the case, if modernists adopt Masonic ideas of God and of morality and of truth, of doctrine and so forth and so on, then quite obviously there would be a lessening of the opposition to membership in Masonry, also reflected by the ecumenical spirit. Right. You know,
and that's why Masonry is succeeding in many ways, because while there's roughly 4 million members, their influence is much greater than that. They've influenced the decisions of the Supreme Court. They've influenced our whole culture today because they can work underground. They have a lot of front groups. They have people who are Masons. According to Masonic law, you can't tell some man's a Mason unless he admits that he's a Mason. Mm-hmm. Jack Kemp's, former Congressman Jack Kemp's a case in point. Jack Kemp never has membership in Masonry in his biography, but he was awarded the 33rd degree up in Massachusetts several years ago. He approached President Reagan, asked if he would become a Mason as directed by the Grand Lodge in New York. That was turned down, and later in 1988, Ronald Reagan did come into Masonry. But unless you knew this behind it, you'd never know it from Jack Kemp that he was a Mason. And the same with many other people. So when we say that there are no Masons on the court now that Thurgood Marshall is gone, that's because nobody questions them on that. That's never asked. All they ask on the court when they're getting the nominee is what's your stand on abortion. They don't care what else you think, you know. Mm-hmm.
What about Masonry and the New World Order? Franklin Roosevelt, who was a very prominent Mason in the 1930s, I believe, put the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum on the back of the dollar bill, New World Order. Is that a Masonic goal? Like we see this all the time in the papers, New World Order, New World Order.
Like the magazine, The New Age.
Yeah, yeah. Sure it is. That's the whole idea. The whole idea is to remake society in a way different from God intended it to be. We only have a second left, and maybe we'll just end with this little quotation from Leo XIII's encyclical on Masonry. He says, "The race of man, after its miserable fall from God, the creator and the giver of heavenly gifts, through the envy of the devil, separated into two diverse and opposite parts, of which the one steadfastly contends for the truth and virtue, the other for those things which are contrary to virtue and the truth. At every period of time, each has been in conflict with the other with a variety and multiplicity of weapons and of warfare, although not always with equal ardor and assault. At this period, however, the partisans of evil seem to be combining together and to be struggling with united vehemence, led on or assisted by that strongly organized and widespread association called the Freemasons."
You've been watching what Catholics believe